Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday the 21st, where we are beginning with our first horror film, and that happens to be The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. What I wanted to do though was to give you a little bit of background before we started talking about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. As you can see in the notes below that I had assigned chapter 1 from the Nightmares book, Origins in Film Gothic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Gothic tradition has helped to establish what we think of as horror film. And I also asked you to read in the horror film book the chapter Genreification, so we could talk a little bit about some of the elements that are associated with the genre of horror film. And then we get to view Dr. Caligari. And also I wanted to talk a little bit about upcoming assignments. So I'll begin with history, that if it is indeed true, and I think it is, that horror film is a history of anxiety, as was stated in your text, then horror films can be used as a way to examine our cultural anxieties and a way for us to examine what we as a people value and don't value. In fact, if you think about our cultural myths and our legends, they oftentimes deal with or attempt to deal with some of the anxieties that we share as a group of individuals. So, Danse Macabre is a very famous text by Stephen King. Stephen King being a very famous author in the horror tradition. Many of his films have been, or many of his novels have been turned into films. But Danse Macabre is an examination of the genre of Gothic and horror. He's very well versed in both. He's got a degree in English and actually has taught classes in this. And I highly recommend the text. I didn't assign it for this class. I do assign it in my Gothic literature class, however. His argument is that horror examines national phobic pressure points, as he puts it, the fears of the masses. So these texts oftentimes will expose the, as I call it, ugly underbelly of society at a particular point in time, whether our fears be political, economic, or social, or some combination thereof. But it does so in allegorical or symbolic ways. So rather than doing that literally, we have to interpret beyond the literal, which is what we oftentimes do when we are reading literature. And that literature has a surface level reading, but beyond the surface level, there usually is something that's implied or suggested, which is why reading literature requires additional analysis and thought. And watching these films will require additional analysis and thought, even though they weren't necessarily initially made for that kind of analysis. They were made for profit and entertainment. But keep in mind that Shakespeare too wanted to entertain and also was able to generate quite a nice amount of profit with his works. That's not to say that despite that, he wasn't able to also give something that was unique, creative, and some social commentary of the time period. So if we think about terror, or at least the way Stephen King defines terror, that probably is the most refined of the three stages, according to King, that we can experience in terms of fear. And the reason why that would be the most refined is because you're required to use your imagination. There's a certain level of subtlety and a certain level of interpretation that's involved. And then Stephen King talks about the mid-level that he calls horror, where it's not entirely of the mind, that some of the fear that we fear, or some of the fear that we are exposed to, is based on something that is specifically shown to us. Let's say a monstrosity. But the gross out, which Stephen King calls the lowest level, that's about revulsion and trying as much as possible to disgust audience. And as King talks about, all three are effective, but the most effective is ultimately that which requires our use of imagination. And if you'll read in the notes below in section 1, I have a short article for you to read by Stephen King. So while I didn't assign Danse Macabre, I did assign Stephen King's article, Why Do We Crave Horror Films? It's a couple pages long or so. And if you're not familiar with Stephen King's writing style, it's very informal, very colloquial. And he talks a little bit about the idea of catharsis. This is a Greek term, which is about a purging of emotion. One of the reasons perhaps that we're attracted to something like horror is that we can experience the emotion, but experience it in a safe way. Much like watching a sad movie allows us to experience sadness, but again, it's within the context of fiction. It would be a very different kind of sadness indeed if it was reality. So going back to the idea of Gothic, this was a historical and an architectural term. The first Gothic novel, or what was established as the first Gothic novel, was a novel by the name of The Castle of Otranto, written in 1764 in England. And while it's not a particularly well-written novel, it has led to the establishment of many of the conventions that we associate with Gothic. Things like monster or villain. And I think I might have shared in the previous class that monstrare comes from the Latin, which means to show or reveal, which I think that all of these films do. They show or reveal elements of ourselves as individuals and elements of our society. Haunted castles or houses. Again, Gothic was initially a historical term. It was oftentimes associated with excess, if you want to think about the big Gothic cathedrals. A damsel in distress, a woman in need of saving. And as we watch these films, we'll see that a lot of these tropes are in these films. A hero, usually male who saves the day or attempts to save the day. The idea of decay, decadence, madness. Madness is going to be particularly evident in our first film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. How it's impossible to escape the past. That there's setting that's dark and gloomy. Think about the idea of Halloween, if you will. Possible supernatural elements, but enough ambiguity so that an individual who's not ready to embrace the supernatural can find a naturalistic explanation. This idea of us and them, anything outside of ourselves viewed as other, alien, or different. And a sense of doubling or doppelganger. This sense that there are multiple sides to everything and that all of us basically have an element of good and evil within us. So there is a sense of predictability and repetition, but at least with the Gothic texts that I study in my Gothic literature class, or in the horror films that I study or have you study or have us study in this class, there also is a creative and literary element associated with them. So the 1800s in England was the height of the Gothic novel, and you've probably heard of some of these novels, even though you may not have read them, such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And we probably know those novels, not so much because of the novels, but because of the film industry, which is why film is so directly tied to the Gothic. And some of the themes that you can expect to find in these texts and in subsequent films and texts afterwards. Good versus evil. Health versus illness. Keep that in mind when we're watching Dr. Caligari. Truth versus deception. That's also something else to keep in mind when we are watching Dr. Caligari. And in fact, good versus evil is also something to keep in mind when we're watching Dr. Caligari. The inside versus the outside. I think I talked a little bit about critics in the last class, and that there's one critic who talks about the idea of being exposed to the inner body as being particularly horrific because we're not used to seeing things like what is supposed to remain inside. Blood, for instance, being one example of a bodily fluid. And of course, as I was suggesting earlier, doubling. And we'll also see that in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And abnormal versus normal, and how does one differentiate between the two? One of my favorite quotes is from Richard Matheson, I Am Legend, where he talks about that normalcy is determined by the majority. And reality versus fiction. I think we'll see all these themes in Caligari, and in fact in the following films, and the films that follow as well. So early Hollywood filmmakers, because this is a class in film, not literature, were oftentimes immigrants, but they used the myths and the superstitions of their old world, and they dramatized that in film. They were required to have a restoration of order. This was part of the film code, that there would be a sense of the good vanquishing the evil. This is something that becomes particularly important when we get to our next horror film, which happens to be Dracula. And that which is considered outside of ourselves is considered evil or other. It needs to be vanquished. Now, one of the ways that this class is structured is by a decade perspective, that the films I've selected give a particularly good commentary on some of the anxieties and fears of that particular decade. And again, this is very much an oversimplification. But the 1920s, and obviously they would have been impacted most by things such as World War I and the mass death and disfigurement that resulted from a world war. And I think that those fears are definitely embedded in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. 1930s. And there are many anxieties and tensions in the 1930s, but we oftentimes think of the 1930s in regards to the Great Depression and the need for escapism, particularly through film. I think it's one of the reasons why those Universal Studio monsters, the golden age of horror films in the 1930s, became so iconic in popular culture and in the mainstream. The Frankensteins and the Draculas, if you will. The 1940s. So we've got a Second World War, but we've also got the rise of abnormal psychology, the sense, or at least the study of abnormal psychology, that we ourselves are the monstrosity. The 1950s, communism, the space age, and the threat of nuclear war. Lots of independent filmmakers during this time period as well. Perhaps in rebellion against some of the conformity associated with the 1950s, or the expected conformity of the 1950s. The 1960s was a time of great turmoil and protest. One could say it's the collapse of the American dream, or the idealistic idea of the American dream that was presented in the 50s. The 1970s was a time of experimentation with taboo. And one might say that it went to such a level of extremism that the 1980s resulted in a response of conservatism, of trying to return back to old world values, whatever those old world values were. 1980s usually associated with the Ronald Reagan political era. The 1990s. And all of these decades have been influenced by technology, but the 1990s was the birth of the internet, perhaps the most revolutionary technology that we have experienced up until this point. The 2000s, and what oftentimes happens at the ending of one millennium and the beginning of another are talks about Armageddon. And the 2000s are particularly interesting because of something called Y2K, which was a technological concern that the computers that have been programmed up until or prior to the year 2000 had not been programmed to accommodate the change from the 1900s to 20s and the 20s. And what might that mean? There was lots of conjecture. It might mean nothing at all, and that's exactly what it was. Or it could mean the complete destruction of our technological networks as we know them. That basically computers could have frozen and our contemporary society and the way that we think of it would be completely dismantled. So I remember very clearly some of the anxieties associated with Y2K. But again, we seamlessly moved into the year 2000 without any difficulties. But prior to that, there was a lot of concern about how that could be the beginning of a kind of Armageddon. And finally, the 2010s. And this would be a decade that would be defined in part by the very historical political election in the United States of the first black president. And Rather than alleviating racial and cultural tensions, it merely increased racial and cultural tensions, as we unfortunately see today in the 2020s. And again, all of the films that I selected in one way or another connect with these very simplified ideas that I've given you about some of the fears and anxieties of the decades. The decade, I think, being a nice way to think of a society, because each generation basically has its own pivotal decade. So the second piece that I had asked you to read was about genreification. Now, a genre is a category, and oftentimes they're seen as less creative and less literary because there are predictable elements associated with them. So horror has predictable elements associated with it. Science fiction has predictable elements associated with it. Romances or rom-coms have predictable elements associated with them. That's part of the enjoyment, is that there's a level of predictability. And yes, there is a level of predictability in horror film, but I would suggest that at least the films that we are going to be examining this semester, they also have an element of creativity associated with them. Fear, especially in relation to film, could be inspired just by the fact that film was able to provide moving images. Think about how revolutionary film would seem in the late 1800s, and something as innocuous as a train pulling into a station or an ocean wave could inspire fear from viewers. In fact, reputedly, there were viewers who watched ocean waves on a screen during this time period and stepped back because they were afraid that they might get wet. That's how realistic it seemed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about upcoming assignments, journals. So as you know, last week you saw a documentary, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, which is also a nice summary of the textbook, or one of the textbooks that I had assigned for class, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, since I realized that people were still adding and dropping and getting adjusted. So I'm hopeful that at this point of the semester, you have your textbooks and you're all caught up and you're all ready to begin with talking about horror film. So there was no assignment based on the documentary outside of the attendance question. As you know, I will be posting these videos every Thursday by 6 p.m., but my goal is to post them earlier with the notes beneath the videos. And you can access the entire class throughout the semester in our top folder for past class sessions, which is where I will retire previous weeks. But what you will see immediately on the front page of the Moodle is the week that we're on. And that happens to be, for us, Dr. Caligari, week 3. Though you can find week 2 and week 1, again, if you were to go into the folder at the top of the Moodle page for past class sessions. I didn't have an assignment on the documentary because the documentary was more introductory. Now we're actually getting into the films themselves and what the films might represent in terms of their particular decade, though it can also go beyond that specific decade as well. So your assignments are to write what I call journals. And this would be approximately a page or so of your reflections about each of the films that we're going to be watching, starting with the Dr. Caligari. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can approach this. Certainly, the readings that I'm assigning can help you formulate ideas and responses, and you're free to include those, as well as the documentary that we saw might help inspire some responses, and you're free to include that as well as your own observations and responses. And I'll always ask an attendance question as well. And while you're not required to respond to your classmates, you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn, so you'll see that I respond to each of you. This will give you an idea of the class discussion that we would have, and it also is information that you could utilize in our journal. So your first journal is going to be based on our first film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Now, whenever I can, I will provide a free link to each of the films. I may not be able to always do so. There are copyright issues involved, though thus far it seems that I've been successful in doing most, if not all, of the films. And if that is the case, that I'm not able to provide a free link, then you have the responsibility of viewing that film on your own. Whether you view the DVD, which is on reserve at the GCC library, or you utilize a streaming service to stream the film, or you borrow the film from a library or another resource, or if you even decide to purchase the film. And because we're watching these films from an analytic perspective, I'm going to give you the same advice that I give to my literature students. I tell my literature students that in order to truly understand a piece of literature, you'd read it 3 times. The first for plot, what's happening. The second for analysis, to try to interpret. And the third to refresh your memory before you're going to write about it or perhaps discuss it. I would suggest the same for these films. 3 viewings. The first for plot, the second for analysis, and the third prior to your discussions or writing about it. Now, I understand that life is not always ideal. You may not necessarily be able to devote 3 viewings of the films, especially the longer films. But do know that each time you watch a film, you're able to get new depth and new sophistication and appreciate not only that, but be able to pick up on details that you would have missed before. In many ways, this is an analysis class. So, that said, if you've seen any of these films before, this is wonderful because it means you're ahead of the game. The more times you can watch a film, the more likely you are to pick up on its subtleties. But as I had indicated in terms of assignments for this class, you will be writing a journal, approximately 1-page response, though it can be as long or as short as you'd like it to be, about the films. And I'm not evaluating for grammar and mechanics, just for content. Think of it as a conversation on paper. And I evaluate it informally. So a plus is excellent. Check plus, very good. A check, satisfactory. Check minus, less than satisfactory, minus unsatisfactory. And we'll be doing this over the course of the semester. So basically, we are watching 11 films. So you will have 11 journals. And my hope and my intent is that if I post a class on Thursday by 6 p.m., that you would have 48 hours to watch that film and to write your journal as well as respond to the attendance question. Then that would give the rest of the time for the class to read the attendance form responses and to do the readings for the upcoming week. So that's my hope. But of course, as you know, if you need an extension, please let me know. But basically, every journal that's listed on your course outline for that particular week, ideally you would submit that in 48 hours later. So for our purposes, that means that by Saturday, what would be ideal is that you have submitted in your first journal. I ask that you submit that via PDF to my email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. This is the way that my grading program works best. And I respond as if we were having a conversation on paper. I will evaluate it with that informal criteria, send that back to your email. And you can see if you're looking at the course outline, you basically have a journal due for each of the upcoming classes for the rest of the semester. It would be based on the week's film that we happen to be watching. You also have an attendance question, as I'm calling it, a discussion form response, that your response would be the attendance, and then any additional conversations you decided to have with your peers would be similar to a class discussion if you raised your hand in class, so to speak. And I know some people learn better through just quiet reflection, and some learn better through more engagement. And I think both are equally valid. But that's how I count your, quote, attendance, unquote, for that particular class. Then the 2 other assignments that I'll be talking about as we get a little bit further on in the semester is that you will have a final project. And the final project is going to be on probably one of the films that we've examined over the course of the semester. But you've got a good amount of latitude. So I believe I was mentioning earlier on about some of the ways that students have used media itself, since this is a media class, in order to examine media. So I've had students film their own horror shorts. I've had students put together video games that have a horror theme. I had a student who basically put together a kind of a diorama, and both of those pieces that this student made, the models of two movies, one being the Dr. Caligari, the other being Psycho, are in the GCC library actually, if you wanted to view them on your own. So you can be creative. As I said, I'll talk about this as we get a little bit further on in the semester. That final project's due by the last day of class. So that means you've got the entire semester to sort of contemplate and think about how to do it and how to go about it. It means it gives us some time to talk about, too, how you can proceed. Then there is a final examination. That is an essay exam. It's open book, open notes, so you're not required to memorize anything. It's about understanding concepts and understanding connections. If we were taking this class live, face-to-face situation, you'd have 2 hours to take your final. We're not taking this class live, obviously. We're taking it online. So you would have 24 hours from the time of posting to submit that in. It would be an essay exam. You have choice within that. And honestly, the best way to study for the final is to watch all these class videos, is to respond to all the discussion questions and to read all the responses in turn, and to do your journals. If you do that, you basically will be well prepared for the final, because all of these elements are a way of sort of thinking about the semester holistically by the time we get to the end. So if you've done 11 journals, by the ending of class, you should have nice commentary on all of the films themselves. Some students actually like to take notes while they're watching film. Some students prefer to watch film and then take notes afterwards. Depends on personal preference. Some students prefer to just do bullet points of important points, and that's fine as well. You don't necessarily have to have complete sentences and paragraphs for the journals. Of course, your final project, if that were a paper, that would be very different, and it would be much more formal and evaluated in a more formal way, which we will talk about. So my goal and my hope is that you can submit in your journal on by Saturday, the 23rd of September, on Dr. Caligari. And I was luckily able to find a link online so that you could watch Dr. Caligari for free, which I've included in the notes below. This film came out in 1920. It's an hour and 14 minutes, which would be a typical length for a Hollywood film at the time. If you are familiar with the very famous film critic, Roger Ebert, he maintains that this is arguably the first horror film. It's the reason why we are beginning with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's because it's helped to establish the tradition of the horror film and the way that we think of it. It's a German film. It's a silent film. It's a black and white film. So already it's going to seem probably very removed from your experiences with watching film. Now, silent films require particularly close attention because you can't rely on dialogue. You have to rely on visuals, though occasionally we are given some captioning. And occasionally you'll see some color because there was some tinting, which was revolutionary for the time, to the film. But we certainly aren't going to get color in the way that we think of color with color films. Again, many of these films were limited by the technology of the times. The director, Robert Wiene, and known as German expressionistic cinema. It was a kind of cinema that was quite popular at the time, that was known for its disjointed imagery, it's surreal, bizarre, it's shadowy, it's very symbolic. So there's lots of representation in there. Rather than literal meaning, there also is representational meaning. And oftentimes examines the themes of madness and death and insanity. If you're familiar with another famous horror film, Nosferatu, which happens to be a bootleg version of Dracula, by the way, so we'll talk a little bit more about Nosferatu when we talk about the film Dracula, then you are familiar with the cinematic technique. So again, if this is your first viewing, it's going to be very bizarre and it could be difficult to follow the plot. We're given a story frame where we have a narrator by the name of Francis who basically is telling us a story. And then at the very ending of the film, we go back to the narrator. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers, at least at this particular point. But you can see in the notes below that I've given some points that you might want to consider for your journal that I'm going to be talking about next class. Now in the notes below as well, in the 5th section, you'll see that what's technically known as the first horror film is a horror film short done in 1896 called The House of the Devil, or The Haunted Castle, French film. And it's only a few seconds long. Obviously, it's a silent film. So I include the link there, if more for curiosity than anything, if you wanted to see. And it happens to be about a man who makes some sort of a deal with a supernatural entity, a devil. So for the time, it was considered quite sophisticated because of its use of, quote, special effects, unquote. You've got characters appearing and disappearing. And again, while it's very short, it does tell a tale about interacting with supernatural entities and the consequences of that. In terms of feature-length film, it's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Note that the film has multiple twists. So again, I don't want to give that away, so you may not want to read the notes below until you actually watch the film. But do expect the theme of madness and insanity to be part of the film. The film talks about a somnambulist. I always have trouble with that word. That's a sleepwalker. And this idea of not being awake, of sleepwalking, is going to be important thematically. Expect themes like madness, fear, trauma, death, disfigurement, mutilation, enforced conformity, economic depression, mass industrialization, terrifying reality, repression, and who is the enemy. These were post-World War I fears that many, if not all, are embedded within films such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Certainly, there are themes of madness and fear and murder in this particular film. Some of the cinematic techniques that you can expect to see are lots of disorienting shapes. It's a very carnivalesque, funhouse sort of atmosphere, and I'll talk about some of the reasons why later. You'll see things like unnaturally high stools and painted shadows on the walls and distorted angles and disjointed mix of art forms. At the time, silent films would have live orchestras for soundtracks in the theater houses. Obviously, that's not going to be the case here. Usually when we see a restored version, which is what we are seeing, the restored Kino version, that's usually the best quality copy that you can find of Dr. Caligari. Remember that we're watching a very old film, something from 1920. So that said, these versions are oftentimes supplied with their own soundtracks, but keep in mind that they wouldn't have had soundtracks initially. They were silent films after all. And soundtracks could be very individual because it would be based on the orchestra at that theater house. But the idea of a soundtrack is to help establish mood. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about this as the semester progresses, about the importance of sound in terms of inspiring fear. Dr. Caligari has oftentimes been called a kind of psychological mindscape, a sort of dreamlike fantasy, and it is very much viewed as an art film. And considering the time in which the film was made, it is quite, I think, extraordinary. Very artistically experimental with this kind of nightmare quality, influencing some filmmakers that you might be familiar with, contemporary filmmakers, such as Tim Burton. So you might see a lot of the same sort of imagery. That said, because it's a silent film, you're going to see some overacting and also some early filming techniques with the question of who ultimately is the enemy. And some of the ways that you can sort of think about this is the philosophical idea that reality is subjective. I think we get that in that iris shot that suggests the individual eye. Notice the camera oftentimes gives us a shot that looks like an eye looking at the action occurring. So, again, in the notes below, I've indicated some of the ways this film has been viewed. If you don't want spoilers, and I suggest you probably don't read the notes below at this point. Just watch the film. Certainly, you can read the notes afterwards, and I'm going to be talking about these at the start of next class. And again, I hope to be able to receive your journal by Saturday, but certainly if you need an extension or if you just prefer to hear my commentary about the film in greater depth the following class, just ask me for an extension and I'll be happy to grant it to you. Our discussion forum question, which will also be due on Saturday the 23rd, is specifically about the ending of Dr. Caligari. And again, certainly you can use elements from the discussion forum in your own journal. But the question on the discussion forum is, what did you think of the ending of Dr. Caligari and why? And we'll talk a little bit about why that ending was controversial. Again, I don't want to talk about the ending too much in depth right now. I don't want to give away spoilers. So basically, we're at the point of, do read Stephen King's Why We Crave Horror Films. You may want to watch that very first horror film short. That's about 3 minutes or so, about a way to think of The House of the Devil or The Haunted Castle as perhaps the first film ever to tackle the genre of horror. But in terms of the first feature-length film, that would be The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and the link is included below. I hope you enjoy the film, and I also hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.